Welcome to today's EnRoute webinar. Today, Aaron Clapp will once again be your presenter. Aaron is in charge of all training here at SAI and knows everything about EnRoute. So today he's going to be going on a little more advanced topics. We're going to be talking about advanced 3D masking and techniques. And that'll probably take about half an hour or so. And then we'll open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, either about the masking techniques and techniques or anything else about EnRoute, we'll open it up. Just type the questions in the chat window on the bottom right there, and we'll answer as many of those as we can so he can review stuff covered, or if you want any clarification, we can do that. And we will be recording today's webinar, so we will post it to the SAI YouTube channel, and we'll send everyone who registered a link so you can go back and review it and follow along whenever you like. And I think that's just about everything. So we'll turn it over to Aaron.
All right, so we have masking and some EnRoute 3D masking and techniques. So we've probably talked about and we've touched on the idea of masking in the past, but it takes kind of a unique or a slightly different form when we talk about 3D, and it has some pretty interesting uses. So just to kind of give a brief overview of masking is basically the idea where we isolate our toolpaths to a particular area depending on what we want to do. So for example, I'm just going to actually copy this over here, and I'll mess with this here for a second. I'm going to take my relief here, and if I toolpath my relief, it doesn't matter really what tool I use, we can see that we get a pretty generic toolpath, as expected. If we add some text to it, or a mask, and we select both of these items, the E, the R, and the 6 now becomes a mask to the relief. And so if I apply that same toolpath, now it's only going to toolpath the letters. And so we can use this method in order to create some very interesting and very complex effects to a particular job in 3D by using this method. Well, how about if we wanted to add, or we wanted to cut out the area around, except and not cut this out here? So let's go back a step. All we would have to do is we would have to add another container to the process here. Now, if you remember the whole container process in EnRoute, you know that if you put something inside of something else, then it highlights a different color. So for example, if I have the square highlighted and I highlight the E now turns red because it recognizes it as an object or a whole or a piece inside of the larger container. So again, we've talked about this before in the past, but it's good to kind of get a quick little overview. And so as we click on, for example, the R and the center of the R, the colors will shift back and forth between blue and red. They'll alternate to indicate what's a whole and what's not. So if I were to select all of these objects, one thing to remember about the whole container whole system is that a relief does not contribute to the container system. So we can demonstrate that easily by selecting the ER6. We would expect these lines to be blue, and obviously we know these would be red. If I shift click the relief, we notice that the letters don't really change, and that's because, again, the relief does not count towards a container. And so that's why it was important for me to draw this extra box on the outside. Now this box could go anywhere. It could be, farther out, further in, kind of just depends on your use case scenario. So now when I highlight this external box, now I get my red letters. And if I were to toolpath this would give me a toolpath that encompasses the entire outside box and excludes the letters. Now, obviously, in this particular example, I put the box way out here, so it extended it beyond the relief and into this area over here. If we were going to be doing a 3D cut, we would pull this in and put this right next to the line or on top of the line. Now this is where when we start getting into masking with 3D, this is where I would strongly advise we start getting familiar with how to use layers. I know we did a webinar in the past on layers. So if you're interested or haven't seen that one yet and you're not really familiar with layers, I would go back and check that out after this episode and just check out the layer on or the episode on layers. That would be a really good review. We want to start using layers in 3D because once we get into three-dimensional type masking, things can get really complicated. And the idea of stacking toolpaths on top of each other starts to become very inefficient. And so we really want to start using layers and masking. So one of the first things we're going to take a look at this morning is something real simple, a simple, easy mask that we're going to show what the differences is going to be between the two. So what I'm going to do is I've actually already created a 3D relief. You can kind of see that here. And again, if you're joining us kind of midstream, we in terms of this series that we've been doing in 3D, we have all of our webinars on our YouTube channel where we've talked about how to create reliefs, how to do all this different stuff. And so if you're kind of lost or not quite sure where you're at, we have addressed a bunch of this stuff. And so it'd be a good idea to check those out if this is the first time seeing anything 3D related. But let's keep going. So I've created like a little wood veneer texture here. Nothing real big. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick. And it's just a real simple wood texture is all we've got here. And so what I want to do is, in order to kind of demonstrate the masking and whatnot, we're going to go ahead and make a couple examples here. So there's two different ways to create this example that we're going to do. So what I want to do is I want to take this EnRoute, and let's actually go to the 3D view, and I want this ER to stand up straight out of the rest of the texture and have it be perfectly flat. So there's two different ways to do that, and I'm going to show you the advantages, disadvantages of both ways. So first of all, the first way is going to be to actually just add this to this relief. So I can take my ER6 and the letters here, I can grab my relief, and then I can say add, and I could just say, maybe I want to make some pointed letters. I don't want to say add. Actually, we're going to do replace. And let's just make the height of these 0.5 inches. I'm going to hit apply and OK. And now what we should see is the change that we've made here is we've got some letters that are standing out straight out of the texture behind us. Now, what are the advantages of doing it this way? Well, the one main advantage of doing it this way is I no longer need these letters. It's fairly simple. I can delete those letters and I can simply toolpath this file as is. Now, the disadvantage that you're going to get is that as your machine goes back and forth in between these letters to cut all this out, when it hits this letter, it's going to have to lift up and then scroll across and then go down and then lift up and go over and down. And it's going to do this process repeatedly. Even with an island fill, you're going to get the same result. It's going to have to lift up and over these letters. So you're going to have a very inefficient toolpath. The other problem that you're going to have is that this looks pretty good here in the perspective view in terms of how sharp these corners look and how nice and even they are. They're not terribly slanted or anything. But as your tool on your machine cuts through this and it ramps down right here, you're actually going to get like a little bit of a curvy spot right here where the bit is actually not able to hit it because it's moving too quickly as it moves and then has to drop suddenly. So again, advantages and disadvantages. This has a few, but let's look at masking. So we're going to take a look at what's the better way to do this. So the better way to do this is to use a mask. So we'll delete this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our same texture. I just grabbed the square and made a blank texture. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a new layer. So I'm going to hit my Layers tab, and this one's going to be my relief, and my second layer is going to be the letters. Click OK. So now I've got two layers here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy everything. Copy. We're going to go to the letters layer and paste to active layer. Now, once I have that, I'm going to take my relief. I don't need my relief twice. And I'm going to delete this. Now, the reason why I've done this in a separate layer is because now, if we take a look at this, my mask is exactly on top of my relief. And so this is going to give me a perfect to the edge representation or mask between here and here. I don't have to create a box out here and then try and reform it and then try and move it into position and do any of that nonsense. I just copy the existing relief, move it to a new layer, and then just delete the relief. That leaves me with the line that was originally created when I first applied the relief. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. I'm going to group it together. And now what I can do is I can turn on all layers. And I'm going to go ahead and hold Shift. And I'm going to click on my relief. Actually, I'm going to do it backwards. I'm going to do the relief first because it's actually a little easier this way. So I'm going to do, let's do this. I'm going to actually remove these letters because I'm in my relief. And because I don't need them anymore, I've cleaned up my artwork a little bit. So I'm going to leave the letters here, but I'm going to remove them from my relief layer. I'm going to highlight my relief layer. I'm going to turn on all layers, hold Shift, and because I grouped them before, I'm going to click on this and it's going to select all my objects. And then I'm just going to do a hatch fill. And let's just clear this out and do a ball nose here. We'll just do an 1/8 inch ball nose, and this is at 0.5 inches deep because that's where I'd put it. And we'll do a 9% overlap and click OK. Just like that. So now I have a toolpath that when I look at this is going to cover everything except for the letters. Now let's go ahead and preview this real quick and see what it looks like. So I'm going to draw a box around here, and you see me do this before, but I'm just doing this so that I don't have to render such a large piece of material. There's no point in me rendering all this out here. So I'm just going to render this little area. It also reduces my resolution megabytes, so it makes the render go a little faster. I'm going to hit play. Okay, and this is what we get. Now, the advantage of this here is we're going to get the same thing, but look at how crisp and clean these edges are. These edges are fantastic. That's because of the way that the toolpath is. The toolpath actually goes around the edges when we do the mask, and so the transition between this texture and this letter is seamless because the bit is not lifting up and traveling across the top of this and then diving back down and then lifting back up every time it runs into this, creating that little arc area that it can't reach. If we look at the toolpath and go back to it, it's going to be a little bit difficult to see, but we'll zoom in real close here. You can see that when we do a hatch fill, it's going to do the hatch fill back and forth, but then it comes back, just like a hatch fill normally does. It comes back and it follows the edge of the letter, just like this. And that creates, and this last toolpath that it's doing is actually going up and down with the alignment of the texture. So as it's following the edge of the letter, it's bumping up and down to match the really clean, crisp sharp edges, vertical edges on your standouts like this that you really, really want. So this is the way that masking, this is a very simple and basic example of how you can use masking in your 3D. Now, this is a pretty easy example, but let's get into something a little more complicated. So I've actually got another file, so I'm going to close this one. And we're going to open up another file that I've actually already set up, and we're just going to walk through it. All right, so here we've got a file that has multiple layers inside of it. And it's got several different things going on here that we want to kind of walk through and explain. So I'm going to turn off all the layers. I'm going to start out here with the relief. So we've got the same exact relief that we had before, same file. This time, what I want to do in this particular case is if I go to several different things here, I've done the same exact thing here. So in our previous file, we used letters. Now what I did here was I created an outline on the text. And if we look at here, I've still got my ER6. And what I did was I just actually went through and I just created an outline by using this tool here. I did an offset close contour, and then I applied an offset to it. I can't remember. I think it was like maybe 0.25 or so inches, maybe 0.5, away from the edge. And it created this nice little boundary. So what this is going to do for me is this is actually going to create a kind of a unique base for my letters. So let's just preview this. So let's take this, and I did the same things. I took my relief, I put it in this layer. I went ahead and did my outside piece, and then I also added a secondary line on here to create the mask for us. So what this is going to do now is this basically creates kind of like a blank right here. So this gives me a nice little platform for me to actually cut this out. Now, I don't want this to be that high. So I'm actually going to mill this down in another step in a moment, because I only want that to be 0.125 inches high. And so I'm actually going to mill this down just a little bit in order to get this lower. So let's take a look at that. That'll be our next step here. So this is my base cut down layer. And what I've done here is this is actually just a very simple hatch fill toolpath, where what I've done, let's look at the properties here. So if we let's actually look at our material thickness. So our material thickness is 0.5 inches. And what I've done is, if you look at it from the side view, and I turn on all layers, what I've done is I've actually moved my relief all the way to the bottom of the plate. And my relief is, I think, 0.5 inches tall. And so I've got 0.5 inches of relief and 0.5 inches of material above that. And so that's how I get this all the way at the bottom. So let's go back to our toolpath here, and we go to Edit Toolpath. This is a basic toolpath. So the first thing that's going to be cut is probably the 3D relief. I'm going to cut out the 3D relief first to give us this nice little platform. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to take my 1/2 inch end mill. And what I've actually done is, and it's really hard to see, but what I did with this was I actually, if we turn on all layers and we look in real close, you see the difference between the lines here. I actually made another outline so that when I cut this down, I don't get these little tiny little sections of pieces still sticking up. I want to make sure that the center of the bit comes all the way to the edge and actually overhangs a little bit, so I get kind of a nice, clean, crisp cut at the edge, and I don't have little tiny pieces left over. So it's very tiny. I think I want to say that I put the distance here at 0.05 or something like that of an outline. So not much, but just enough to get the bit to hang off the edge a little bit to make sure it cleans off those edges really well. So let's take a look here again. So I did the Edit Toolpath. Now this is one of those tricky points, and if you've ever talked to me in tech support, you'll know that I always tell you to leave your surface at 0. In this case, we're going to leave our surface at 0, but when we go into our next cut, we're actually going to start modifying the surface depth. This surface depth defines where the surface is on the material when it's cutting. And we'll see this come into play here in a second. But for us, in our purposes, all I wanted to do was I wanted to mill down that flat area about 0.125 inches deep. And that's all I wanted to do. So if we look at what this has done for me now, let's go into my layers and let's turn on the relief. Let's see, no, not the relief. That's the wrong one. Not relief. We want the letters. Okay, hold on here. Where's my relief, letters? Okay, base cut down and base cutout. Okay, that's what it is. Base cut down and base cutout. Apparently, I did not label those well enough for me to know what they were. Better naming convention. That's the lesson there. Base cutout and base cut down is what we want. So we'll hit OK. So that's going to show me both the cut down layer and then the relief cut down. So we will hit our preview here. And it's going to look a lot similar to our previous, except for now when we zoom in, you can see that it's not quite as tall anymore. A little bit has been cut off the edge. Now, the third step in this file, and what I wanted to do, and this is kind of, depend on what you want to do, is I wanted to carve in some 3D carved letters into the surface of this flat area that I created here. So how do I do that? Well, this is where our surface setting comes into play, and it's also where we add in a new layer. So let's go back to our layers, and let's only turn on one layer at a time here. Oops, there we go. And let's go to our letters layer. Okay, so again, I'm actually not even applying this toolpath in a 3D way at all. These actually are a lot of these toolpaths. So for the base, this is a 3D cut. So this, we are cutting out the 3D, but this base cut down is just a 2D cut. And so is this letters. It's a 2D cut that I'm using an Engrave toolpath with. So here's what we're going to do. Remember, edit this toolpath. I put two different tools in here. So when I set up an island fill, if I set a 1/4 inch end mill first, this is going to hog out the center of the letter. And then I went in here and I selected my 90-degree conic and I told it to be a clean toolpath. But here's where we added one little step. I clicked in here, and under the 90-degree conic, I chose 3D toolpath. This is basically what this little checkbox does, is it essentially tells the island fill, hey, I want you to do a 3D engrave just like you were doing an engraved letter, but I want you to do it in the island fill. But the end mill allows me to hog out the center of the material so that I get a nice flat bottom to my letter. So I'm going to have a beveled edge and then a flat bottom down here. Now, here's where we talked about our surface depth. So remember how we said that I milled the center platform for these letters to sit on. I milled them down about 0.125 inches. So that means that the surface is no longer at 0, 0 anymore. So I can do one of two things. I can set the depth at 0.25, and it might give me a similar result. The problem you may end up with that is if I just put in the depth and left my surface at 0, what might actually happen is the toolpath might not act properly, and you might not get the expected result because it's basing all of its mathematics on the idea that you still had your 0, 0 is at the top of the plate. There's still material. It thinks there's still material there. So you're gonna get something that you don't want. And that's where the surface setting comes into play. So we say, okay, how deep do I want this 3D engrave to go? Well, I've told it that I want it to only go 0.125 inches. Remember, we're only dealing with half-inch material here, and my 3D relief is technically only half an inch deep or half an inch thick. So I want it to go 0.125 inches deep, but I need to tell the software that, hey, by the way, there's another toolpath that I already processed that milled the surface down a little bit. So the 0, 0 is no longer at 0. It's actually down a little bit. So that's why I put in 0.125. I milled down the surface of that cutout at 0.125 inches. So that's why I'm putting that here. So as long as I put that in here and I set my final depth and click OK, I'm going to hit cancel there because the toolpath is already applied. But if we look at it from the side view, these little angled pieces right here, these are my 3D engrave for the ER6. If I had not put in the 0.125, these lines would actually be up here at 0, 0. So essentially what it's done is it's dropped the toolpath 0.125 inches and then started from there. So this right here is now its new 0, 0. That's what the surface option does for us. Now, you don't have to, it doesn't apply in every situation. You may not always need to use that surface option. But in this case, because we're doing the 3D engrave, it's really important if we want to get the right effect that we start at the right depth. Otherwise, it'll throw our depths off and our cuts off a little bit. So that's how we add this last little piece. Now, let's go ahead and put it all together. And this is what's really great about layering and doing things in layers and masks, is that at any point, if I ever want to go back and let's say I really don't like the way that ER6 worked, I can simply come back in here and I can change it whenever I want. My toolpaths aren't stacked on top of each other multiple times, so I don't have to delete everything and then start over. I have everything sectioned off into layers, so if I ever have to change anything for whatever reason, it's very easy to do. In fact, what's really nice is if I wanted to easily just go back and change my relief, I can change my relief in a snap. All I have to do is remove the toolpath, delete the relief, apply a different relief, reapply the toolpath. It's really, really easy. So using these layers and using these masking techniques in this way really kind of helps you organize your job. Now, one of the things is with layering and masking is that there is a lot of forethought that has to go into it. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start working on a project and realize, oh, I got to backpedal a couple steps because I need to probably start using layers. So I'll start putting some layers into different places, and then I'll start working on it again and realize, oh, I think this needs to go into another layer. So I should put this and this and this should go in its own layer by itself. And you can kind of start working it in that way. So let's go ahead and add all parts and click our preview. Hit OK, we'll hit play, hit the light bulb. And then this is our final result. So we have a veneer texture, a wood veneer texture. We have a base sticking up. And then we have our letters that are actually cut deeper than our relief. So we have like a multi-tiered effect going on here. And so This is what the idea of masking can allow you to do. You don't have to stack all of these effects on top of each other with using 3D. You could, if you really wanted to, you could go into EnRoute and you could actually create this same sign all in 3D. But this is going to cut much faster, and this is going to be easier to modify down the road. And then you can also change tool paths if you need to, or change out interchange pieces or whatever. It's almost like a template. If I wanted to change the words, I can change the words. You know, it makes changing anything in here a little bit easier. So those are kind of some advanced things there. We talked about creating a mask and using 2D toolpathing to create interesting effects with masking in order to create these types of effects. Oh, now I wanted to show you one quick thing before we end. And I wanted to show you a sign that the developer of EnRoute created. This was way back in 2016 in one of our workshops. And it was kind of a really unique piece. So it's very similar, or uses the same exact techniques that we showed here today. He created a 3D background, and what he did was he created this outline shape right here and just milled this down to a certain height. He did the same thing up here. He had this circle, or this, circle, oval shape, and he used that, and then just, like I said, just used a 2D cut to mill that down. Then he did something very similar to what we did, is he used a island fill with a 3D engrave to cut out these letters. And then down here, he just did the opposite. What he did here was he actually just used the pyramid tool on top of, instead of using a 3D engrave, he just used the pyramid tool in order to get these letters. Now, obviously, you would need to make sure that you place your tool pathing in the right order. So when he milled out this edge here, he also had to create a mask for these little letters, because you wouldn't want to knock out that whole section of letters. Up here, we didn't really have to worry about that because we've got the letters sink down into the material. Up here, you'd have to create another mask for the letters so that the milling, when you came out and milled out this flat piece, only mills out these areas and then leaves these nice little standing pieces here where you can come back later and apply a different toolpath to just the standing letters. So this is another good example of creating a part in EnRoute that mixes 3D with 2D toolpathing using masking and layers. So hopefully this will kind of give you some ideas to think about. Again, we really like this because it makes signs, making signs with backgrounds really, really easy. This is a pretty common thing to do, to have a 3D sign with a customer's logo on it that basically stands out and then has the 3D texture in the background. This is a pretty common sign that we see people doing a lot. And so this actually makes it super easy to be able to throw your toolpaths in, mask off that area, and then be able to change it as you need to, because it makes it a lot simpler than trying to add the 3D layers on top of each other, because that's when things start to get more complicated. The more 3D effects that you stack on top of an object, the more complex it gets, the harder it becomes at managing that and toolpathing it and things like that. This here, doing it this way with the masks, is also a big time saver as well. The more that you can do with two-dimensional toolpathing, the better you're going to be, simply because the overlap amount. So to create this background here, typically you want to use a fairly high overlap. You're going to be doing an overlap of 75 to 90% overlap, depending on the tool that you're using and whatnot. So that's going to take some time. So if there's places in the file that you can use this masking to avoid having to cut out those areas with a 70% or 90% overlap, It's going to save you a ton of time. And not only that, you'll get a better looking quality product anyway, as far as your edge quality and different things like that. So let's jump into some questions and see what we got from here.
Thank you so much for going over all of that. And if anyone does have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat window there, and we'll go through as many of those as we can. So Charles just said, I am assuming no overcut on anything. Is that right?
Not in this, yeah, not in this particular case. That's a good question, though. You could apply overcut on anything that you want. And so to illustrate what he's talking about here is that when I zoom in, you'll notice that I didn't apply an overcut here. I probably should have at least applied an overcut on the edge here. So this particular toolpath, I probably should have gone in here and again, we actually need to delete the toolpath here because, so, okay, yeah, we just need to delete the toolpath and then reapply it because with 3D, you can't really edit overcut. So if I apply an overcut, and even if I leave the overcut amount at 0 and click OK, the difference is going to be is that now the toolpath goes right to the edge. Sometimes you're going to want to do that, and sometimes you're not going to need to. So some of the other toolpaths that we applied here, for example, the base cut down, I went ahead and added well, let's just put it this way. Sorry, you cannot add an overcut to a two-dimensional cut. So for example, this island fill here, I didn't apply this to the relief at all. This is just a 2D geometry. So that overcut option is not actually there. And that's why I made it a little bit bigger inside my geometry. When I went to cut it, I made it a little bit bigger so that the tool would overhang just slightly. So just be aware of that. If there's sections like this where you're applying 2D toolpaths and you want it to overhang a little bit, you'll have to just create an outline that's a little bit larger. But in the 3D part, that's a good place for me to actually apply that overcut.
Okay, and then Christopher said, doesn't the overcut also cut into the masked area?
It would, yes, it would. So that's kind of where you kind of need to determine what you want to do. Here's a good solution to that problem. So if instead of doing that, what I could do is I could simply make my 3D relief a little bit larger and then just have an end mill slice off the edge here so that I don't have to really worry about whether it's going to be big enough or not. I can make the 3D relief slightly larger on all sides. Doesn't have to be much, maybe 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch. Doesn't really have to be a whole lot. And then what I can do is I could just create a square that goes right up to the edge, just like this. And if we zoom in here, then what I would just do is I'd pull this to the edge or something like this, and then I just use this to slice off the edge with an end mill and cut out the entire piece. That's kind of what they did here. What he did here was he had the relief going beyond the actual file itself and then just took an end mill and sliced it off right here. So it kind of gives you, now obviously he sanded this down a little bit to kind of give them some smooth edges here with that just hand sanding. But the idea here is that I don't want to have to really worry about where my texture is going. So he made his texture larger and then just cut it off. And then it looks natural because you had extra there to cut off. So yes, that's why I say you kind of have to be careful with the overlap setting when doing this kind of stuff, is because it will overlap on both sides. And so in this particular case, I probably wouldn't do it. I would make my relief bigger, cut it off, and then call it good. Leave my overlap setting at 0. Turn it off completely.
Okay. And then had another question from Paul. He said, why did you select 3D Engrave versus unchecked?
So the 3D Engrave is the feature in EnRoute that allows you to create 3D carved letters based on the size of your letter. So if we take, let's just go into our letters here. If we take this here, so what 3D Engrave does is 3D Engrave does several different things. If I just choose Engrave, all it does is it puts a line. I'll see here. Did I choose 3D Engrave on that? Hold on. Okay, I had that turned on. So if I just choose no 3D Engrave and I click OK, what it does here is it just puts a line. It just follows the edge of the lines. The difference between just a standard engrave, which this is, versus a 3D engrave is going to be this option right here. And what it does is it actually prevents the tool path or the tool from ever going outside the letter. So here's a really good example. Let's just take this, for example, and let's delete this one. And we don't need that tool for this example. And we'll turn off 3D Engrave here. So one of the things we talked about, I think we addressed this in one of our webinars. I can't remember which one, though. But let's just take this. We'll look at the differences between the 3D Engrave. You'll notice that the standard Engrave has a lot of blowout in it. It kind of, well, in this case, you're probably not going to see it a whole lot. But the 3D Engrave is going to try and keep the letters together as much as possible. Now, it still did a little bit of overlapping up here. Let's see, which one did I do now I've forgotten. Okay, so the bottom one here is, okay, I got them confused. So if we look at this again, the top one, you can see, kind of blows out the letter right here. So we've actually gone beyond the letter and we've interfered with each other on this. Whereas here, the tool will always remain inside of the width of the letter. It's never going to go outside the width of the letter. Now, again, this is kind of a poor example, but this is why I added the end mill, by the way. Because when you just do a standard 3D engrave at a shallow depth, it's going to leave a little bit of material in the middle. And so I really don't want that there. So that's why I added the 1/4 inch end mill, because then that 1/4 inch end mill just hogs out this whole section right here and leaves me with a flat base, but still leaves this here. Now, if I were to go deeper and deeper and deeper with this, I could, and eventually there will become a point where the 3D engrave does actually meet itself down at the bottom, and you get a perfect V-groove letter. So, that's part of that as well. But the nice thing is that with the 3D engrave, it will never go outside the boundaries of the letter. It will always maintain its tool path inside the boundary of the letter, and you can kind of see that here. The 3D engrave is maintaining itself inside, whereas this toolpath, it just follows the edge, and if it happens to interfere with other parts of the cut, too bad. That's just kind of the way the regular engrave works.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question from Christopher. Said, for a 2D cut, would you be able to set a negative inlay to make an overcut?
You could. I think so. Yes, you can do it either way. So here's the way I did it with the base cutout. So here's the original. Actually, we'll just start from the letters. This is what I did. I took the letters, and let's delete the tool paths. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. Okay, so here's how I started. Here's how I got this shape right here. This shape that we're looking at right here, this is how I got this. I took my letters, just like this. I went over to my outline tool, and I said, I want to create an outline at 0.5 inches, like this. And then I kind of tweaked this a little bit. I think I made it a little bit bigger, something like this. I think it was actually 0.6 is what I actually applied it as. So I hit apply. And then what I did was I came in here and I ungrouped it. And I just went in here and deleted this stuff. This is too small. Those things will break apart. I deleted those. And then I went into my add fillets to contours. So basically just rounding off the corners of contours. And I put a 0.2 radius on all of my contours here and just hit apply. And so I just rounded these off really easily for myself because I figured, well, there's no point in having these big sections in here, which I want these to be rounded. It'll make it easier to cut. So this is how I made this shape. So this is what I did to get to here. So I got to here. Now I have this outside shape. When I went to make my overcut, so when I did this cut here, the base cut down, what'll happen is if I island fill this and I cut right to the very edge of this with a tool, a lot of times you'll have like tiny little splinters of pieces of wood sticking up still that didn't get cut. So I wanted to do an overcut because I know that the material over here is going to get removed by the relief cut. So there's nothing going to be over here that's going to be in danger of getting hit. So I'm going to do an overcut. So I'll go to my outline tool again, and I just did a 0.05 outline, just like that, and hit apply. So now I've got 2 lines, and then I just deleted this one and said, okay, this is going to be the cut that I'm going to use so that my tool will overhang just a little bit off the edge. If you do an inlay with the inlay feature, so if I were to do like an island fill with the inlay option, the inlay option is mainly geared towards channel letters, and so what it does is it rounds off corners. It doesn't actually push the tool out beyond the edge of the path. And so that's where there's a little bit of a difference there. So maybe not, I mean, there's a possibility you could, but the easiest way I found it to do was just to take that shape and then just add an outline to it of however much I wanted it to overlap the previous cut.
Okay. Then let's see. We've got one from Brendan. It said, is there a benefit to using the mask when applying toolpaths versus incorporating them in the relief itself?
Yes, mainly time. The biggest thing that you're going to see is time and then cleanness of edges. So in this illustration that we had here, those masks were giving us really clean edges. The other thing is time. So if I go back to, let's go back to our relief, and let's go and just illustrate this real quick with the previous example that I did, where I took these letters and I added a relief to it. So add, or flat, we added a 0.5 inches and hit OK. So here we've got 2 reliefs. One of them has the ER6 flat spot already added, the standout letters, it has it already added for us. Okay, so here's going to be the big difference. So I'm going to need to add a mask. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my relief, and I'm just going to put a 0.05 outline on it. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to use my hatch fill, and I'm going to use my ball end mill. We're going down 0.5 inches, and we're going to do 90% overlap. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here, same exact tool path, except for this hatch fill. Okay. So now here's the big difference that you'll notice is that this whole section has been skipped. So this is actually area that it doesn't have to cut in. Whereas over here, I'm actually still having to go up and over these letters. So as the tool goes across, it's still going across these letters. And if I turn this off and I zoom in a little bit, you can see that there's no real difference in the way that the tool goes. It's just going back and forth. And so depending on how, let's just say that you don't want to cut this down and you just wanted to leave it at the same height as the material. That's a lot of wasted extra time where your bit is coming over these letters and then just not cutting anything. Or even if it is cutting something, it's still having to do something at a 90% overlap. Whereas here, let's say I did this, and let's just say I took these letters and I said, well, maybe I don't like the way that they're standing up straight. I want them to be reduced just a little bit. I would still recommend taking the letters. So I would hit Control Copy, and let's just do a new layer. We'll call it Test here.
And Aaron, just to let you know, Brandon commented, he said, I was thinking having the outer contour and the letters selected when making the initial relief.
You could do that as well. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so doing it like, yes, okay, I see what you're saying there. Perfect, like this. So we delete this, and instead of, we would have to delete our relief here. Let's do this. Let's get rid of that line. And we would have to delete our relief and then reapply our texture. So add, we're going to start with a no thickness relief. And then we would add our veneer texture to that. So you'd get this. The difference here is going to, whoops, what we got going on here? So our 3D, scooch that over there. Our perspective view is messed up a little bit. There we go. The difference there is going to be, I don't like this sharp drop off that happens here. So here's what can happen is that when you have a sharp drop off like that, you don't get as good or as a clean of a cut, because again, your tool is just going right to the edge and stopping. You could apply an overcut and do the same thing, but then you're cutting into the side of the letter. So if you intended to have these letters standing out, the letter would actually get cut into slightly by doing an overcut. The advantage of doing the mask like this is that it doesn't do that. And as we zoom in, it creates that path all the way, now not in this case because we did the overcut, remember? But if we remove the overcut, it adds one little tool path all the way around the edge of your letter that kind of cleans up the edge and makes sure that there's no spots where the tool jabbed into the letter. That would be probably the disadvantage there. And also, the other thing that we kind of just talked about in general is just the idea of, if I wanted to make variations of this sign with different sets of letters, I have to go back and recreate this every single time. I have to delete my relief, go back, reapply my reliefs, do all that. This way, all I have is I have a base relief, and then I can put anything I want on top of it. So I can duplicate this sign 15 times, and all I have to do is change the text, and I'm pretty much good to go. So it's a little bit quicker. This tends to lead to some issues. It is a way to do it. I wouldn't say it's necessarily wrong. There's just some disadvantages to it that I prefer. I think this ends up looking a little bit cleaner down in the long road. This looks a little bit better. But you could do it both ways. I just prefer the masking better.
Okay. Brandon, that's a great explanation. The jagged edges are a problem sometimes. Okay, so I think that's about all the time we have for today. But I want to thank everyone for attending, for all the great questions. And Aaron, I just wanted to let you know that everyone's saying thank you for the explanations as you have answered those questions. I want to thank you for taking the time to go over all of those.
No problem.
This will be the last webinar for 2020. And we will have our next webinar. Let me make sure I have the correct date here. It's going to be next month, January. It's on January 19th. We'll be talking about advanced nesting. So we will send everyone an email with an invite to that webinar for the 19th. And of course, we'll send out the email with the link to today's recording, so you can review that whenever you like. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your year, and we will see you in January. Thank you.